Hey Science 30, so this is the next video in the biology unit. We're going to continue talking about our 5 different blood vessels that we're going to talk about specifically. So last video we ended here saying that we have arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. And they go in that order. Leaving the heart, you start with the artery and then you end up back at the heart through a big vein. And so we have to understand this entire time, where is the oxygen high and where is the carbon dioxide high? And where oxygen is high, carbon dioxide should be low. And then where carbon dioxide is high, oxygen should be low. And there's a reason for that, and we'll kind of show that visually as we go here. So arteries and arterioles are going to carry oxygenated blood. So they're high in oxygen, O2. Venules and veins carry deoxygenated blood. They're low in oxygen. Now, at some point, that transition happens, and that transition is at the capillaries. And the capillaries is literally the site of exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, as well as nutrients and wastes between the blood and the tissues that the blood is moving through. And so every single muscle, tissue, organ is cellularly respiring. It's taking in oxygen and it's letting out carbon dioxide. And so you have to make sure that oxygenated blood arrives to those tissues to allow for cellular respiration to occur. So those tissues need oxygen. So they'll take the oxygen out of the oxygenated blood and they will push unwanted CO2 into the blood. Once the CO2 has entered the blood, this deoxygenated blood moves through venules and veins back to the heart so that it can go through pulmonary circulation, which you don't see in this little diagram, can go to the lungs, get oxygenated in the lungs, and then come back into the heart, get pumped as oxygenated blood back through the arteries into capillaries, exchange with tissues, and then have CO2-rich blood do the whole loop all over again. So one more time, in a bit of a nicer picture here, blood is going to leave the heart. I've drawn it in red. It's an artery. Arteries start with the letter A for away from the heart, and this is carrying oxygenated blood. That blood is then going to go into arterioles. Arterioles are slightly smaller blood vessels, but they're very much like arteries, and they still contain quite high blood pressure. The heart pumps at a really good oomph. It's pushing that blood good pressure. It's going to push that blood through tissues. At capillaries, the tissues are going to exchange blood, waste, nutrients, oxygen, carbon dioxide. So this is called diffusion, right? Oxygen is going to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, and carbon dioxide is going to move from an area of high concentration in the tissues to an area of low concentration in the blood, as well as the waste and the nutrients. Then we enter these small venules, and then we enter these larger veins, and the veins will eventually take that deoxygenated, carbon dioxide-rich, waste-rich blood back to the heart. So just to specify a little bit more here for you, oxygen is going to diffuse out of the capillaries and into the brain and surrounding cells, whatever organ we're looking at. Carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out of brain cells or whatever tissue organ we're looking at, and wastes are also going to move out of those cells and into the capillaries to be taken away. And so CO2 leaves the cells, enters the veins to get taken away. Oxygen enters the cells from the veins into the tissues to help those cells and tissues and organs do their regular life processes. So quick breakdown here. Arteries and arterioles. Well, remember, the big takeaway, A for away. So arteries and arterioles are moving blood away from the heart. They're thick, like their actual blood vessels are quite thick. They've got a huge membrane around them, and they're stretchy. And there's a very specific reason for arteries needing to be stretchy and thick. The heart is pumping blood at a very high blood pressure. And so when it pumps that blood, those blood vessels, arteries, and arterioles that are closest to the heart need to be able to withstand that pressure. Because if the heart pumps and those arteries are weak, they're going to tear, they're going to burst, and you're going to hemorrhage and bleed out internally. And that's not good. And so we want to make sure these blood vessels are thick and there's nothing obstructing the flow inside. We'll talk about when you have like a high cholesterol diet, you build fatty tissues up inside your arteries. Atherosclerosis is what it's called. and that's going to cause an issue because it stiffens these blood vessels and narrows these blood vessels, and then the high blood pressure has trouble pushing blood through them, and eventually you either have reduced blood flow or you burst a blood vessel. So the function of arteries and arterioles is obviously to carry blood away from the heart and deliver it to the blood tissues and organs. I just want you to remember then that these are thick muscular walls and that they stretch. So the big takeaway, arteries and arterioles are thick, they're muscular, they stretch easily to handle the high blood pressure, and they move blood away from the heart. You never want to sever an artery, fun fact, because if you sever an artery, the blood is moving at such high pressure, you will literally spray blood. It'll project far, you'll lose a lot of blood much faster than if you cut a vein. So an aneurysm is when you have a weak spot in an artery. So you can have a brain aneurysm, you can have an aneurysm elsewhere in your body as well. And this is simply when, not simply, but this is when you have a weak portion of an artery, and that weak portion, no matter where it is not able to withstand the pressure of blood pushing through it. And so it bursts the blood. And like I said, you will bleed out. So eventually, right here, this little lump here is not normal. This is an aneurysm waiting to burst. The artery looks like this, but it's for some reason weakened in this spot. And eventually, it could just take an increase of your blood pressure, maybe a higher heart rate, maybe you exercise a little too much that day, and boom, that bursts. Stress will also do that too. So you want to make sure that you are healthy so that weak spots in arteries don't happen. Diet and exercise and rest and reducing stress in your life can all help avoid weak spots in your arteries from forming. We can stop these. We can surgically alter this by accessing the artery and inserting a stent or a scaffolded piece inside of the blood vessel to help support that weak tissue around that portion of the artery. Atherosclerosis, we mentioned this. This is what you always hear about. Don't eat fatty foods. Don't have high cholesterol foods because it'll clog your arteries. It does exactly that. It's called atherosclerosis. This is the buildup of fatty tissue and fatty material inside the artery. Remember, when you build up a thicker wall of fat inside the artery, you do two things. You reduce the ability of the artery to stretch, which is a problem when the pressure is so high, and you also narrow the hole that the blood is able to move through, which is going to increase your blood pressure as well. You don't want this. So good diet, constant exercise, lots of water, lots of sleep, stress-free life, all of these things, like I said, are going to help reduce your factors for something like atherosclerosis. Then we move into capillaries. Well, capillaries are really, really small. In fact, they're the smallest blood vessel in the body. They have thin walls, and they're only one cell thick. And they have to only be one cell thick for a very specific reason. They need to exchange or diffuse oxygen and nutrients throughout their tissues and carbon dioxide and waste throughout their tissues. And the only way they could do that without having to have any sort of active transport allowing them to cross the membrane or the wall of the capillary tissue is by being very thin. So they're only one cell thick or thin, and so they allow things to pass through very quickly. So look at this picture here. They're very porous. Things can move in and out of capillaries very easily. And that's by design, right? Because as oxygen leaves, CO2 will enter the capillary to go back into a vein, to go back to the heart, to get reoxygenated by the lungs. And so what I would like you to take away from this is that capillaries is the site of exchange for nutrients and wastes. Capillaries are very thin, capillaries are very small, and capillaries are the site for diffusion. Oxygen and nutrients are going to leave the capillaries and enter the tissues so that they can be used. And then carbon dioxide and waste are going to leave the tissues and enter the capillaries so they can enter the blood to be taken back to the heart. So let's do a little example here. I'm going to get you to pause the video and try to answer this question. Okay, so here we've got a couple labels. We've got X, which is the beginning of this capillary. We've got Y, which is the end of this capillary. I'm noticing it says blood flow is going from left to right. And then I've got these little square cells here. I've got site W and site Z. W is at the beginning of the tissues, Z is at the end of the tissues. And they're asking me, hey, where is blood high? So at X, blood is currently high in what? Well, at the beginning of this capillary, let's say, blood should be high in oxygen and nutrients. And the blood at this point is going to be low in wastes and CO2 because it hasn't actually dropped off that material yet. But at position Y, it's already crossed the length of this tissue. It's now going to be low in, or pardon me, high in carbon dioxide and wastes at the beginning, and then it's going to be low in oxygen and nutrients at point Y. So let me say that again here. At X, we are high in oxygen and nutrients, and at Y, at this point, we are high in carbon dioxide and waste. So blood has taken the oxygenated blood and nutrients and dropped it off. And at Y, it's picked up the waste and CO2, and it's taking it away back to the heart. And then we could say the opposite for Z and W. At point Z, we're high in oxygen and nutrients. At point W, we were high in carbon dioxide and wastes. Okay. Lastly, we're going to do veins and venules. So big thing here, I want you to remember that veins have valves, and there's a very specific reason for that. These valves are one-way valves that allow for the blood to keep moving in one direction. Think about it. By the time blood has gone from the heart through the arteries, it was high pressure. It had to slow down in pressure so that it could get to the capillaries and exchange nutrients and waste, oxygen and CO2. By the time that oxygen poor blood, the deoxygenated blood, enters the venules, it's at a very low pressure, and it's probably already in places that are quite far away from the body, like in your foot. And so to go from your big toe all the way back up to the heart, that's a long way up against gravity, and you need a way to get that blood up back to the heart easier. So the veins have these one-way valves in them that open to allow blood to go up, but then shut behind it to not allow blood to go back down. And so that's what this picture here is illustrating. It allows blood to go up, but does not allow blood to go back. Now, we have veins to bring blood back to the heart. We have valves in the veins because the pressure is low and we don't want blood to back up and pool in our legs and extremities that are lower in against gravity. And so we can get something called varicose veins. Varicose veins are, it happens in older people, it happens in people that are less fit. Diet can play a role here, but varicose veins occur when the valves start to not tightly seal, and the blood actually does backflow through the valve, even though they're not supposed to, and the blood pools in the lower regions of the vein. So blood, because it's at such low pressure, it doesn't actually go up back to the heart like it should. And so it physically, literally starts to pool, and you see them as little bumpy veins. So with that being said, the return of blood to the heart involves two problems. Blood is under low pressure, which we've discussed. So it doesn't have enough oomph to go back to the heart. And blood has to go against gravity. So how does the body, or how do veins counteract this? Well, veins have valves. And so these are one-way valves, like I said. They open up to allow blood to go back up to the heart, and they should normally shut nice and tight to stop the backflow of blood. So it constantly forces blood up. If those valves don't close properly, you get varicose veins, like we discussed. But you also have muscles. So skeletal muscles around veins contract, which helps push the blood back up to the heart. So this is why you should get up every once in a while. This is why when you're sitting at a desk or sitting on the toilet for forever and you start to feel your legs go numb, because you're sitting there on your phone, you get those pins and needles in your legs because you haven't had the proper blood flow back up. This is why you should get up and walk around and move your calves up and down. Tighten your calves, relax your calves, tighten your calves, relax your calves, because that's going to help squeeze the blood through the veins and up in the direction that it should. Helps with that movement. Okay, the next video we're going to talk about blood pressure and where the blood pressure is in each of these arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. Thanks, guys.